Welcome back for Module 2, and in this module we're going to be looking at Chapters 2 and 3 in Agnew and Brezina. First, let's talk about measuring delinquency. Measuring the occurrence of crime is itself very difficult. There are generally three measures. First, crimes reported to the police. For example, see the FBI's Uniform Crime Report. Second, there is victim data. For example, the Bureau of Justice's National Crime Victimization Survey. And lastly, there is self-report data, although there are few national studies that cover every kind of delinquent crime. Let's look at each of these in turn. First, there's the Uniform Crime Report, UCR. It reports data on both the number of reported crimes as well as the estimated number of arrests. About 95% of police precincts across the U.S. participate in the UCR. These are considered the official statistics on crime. You'll often see reports both as a percentage of the total population and as a rate per 100,000 individuals. The UCR reports on 8 Part 1 offenses, also known as index offenses: criminal homicide, forcible rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny theft, and motor vehicle theft. Now, there's an 8th special case, an index offenses, which is arson. If the arson causes a death, the homicide is reported as a violent crime. Otherwise, the arson is reported as a property crime. Local law enforcement agencies report arsons less often and/or with less specificity, so arson data in the UCR are limited. The UCR also reports on 20 Part 2 offenses, which include everything from forgery and counterfeiting to vandalism to prostitution to offenses against family and children. Be sure to take a closer look at these in Chapter 2. The disadvantages of the UCR include that arrest rates vastly underestimate crime, particularly among juveniles. So let's stick with reported crimes unless you have a specific reason to look at arrest rates. Further, even among crimes reported to the police, offenders are rarely caught, especially in mischievous crimes usually committed by juveniles, vandalism and shoplifting as examples. And lastly, the UCR arrest data only includes the most serious offense for which an individual is arrested. For example, if a juvenile gets drunk, steals a car, and while joyriding hits and kills a pedestrian, only the vehicular manslaughter arrest would be included in the UCR arrest data. So while the UCR is incredibly valuable, it has its limitations. For that reason, we also look at the National Crime Victimization Survey. It started in the 1970s, asking people to report if they had been victims of certain types of crimes. The advantage here, I hope, is obvious. The NCVS includes data about crimes that have been reported to the police, as well as crimes that have not been reported to the police. The NCVS is a nationally representative sample of about 50,000 households, and because data are from victims, it allows the U.S. Department of Justice to calculate the chance of victimization. The disadvantages of the NCVS include, in terms of juvenile delinquency in particular, it only questions victims age 12 and older. Many victims of juvenile crimes are juveniles themselves, many of whom are younger than age 12. Also, NCVS data are detailed in terms of what type of crime was committed, when, by whom, at least a description of the criminal, the degree of the offense, that is simple or aggravated, and that's a good thing. But it means few crimes are categorized, few crime categories can be queried in a reasonable amount of time. Only a few violent and property crimes are included. There's no inclusion of, for example, drug use or status offenses. Okay. That brings us to self-report data. These are representative samples of juveniles who are asked to report which behaviors they themselves have engaged in. See Table 2.2 in Agnew and Brezina for an example. Respondents are assured anonymity or confidentiality. There is a growing awareness for a need for more reliable data in this area. One good reliable source is administered by the Centers for Disease Control, called the Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System, or YRBSS. It is a major source for public health data, and now it includes more questions on behaviors that are illegal or could lead to crime, for example, carrying a gun, having been involved in a fight, and so on. Of course, there are a few drawbacks to self-report data as well. For example, how do we know if respondents are telling the truth? Some respondents exaggerate. Others underreport, especially regarding serious offenses. Several studies have compared self-report data to official records to see how closely they match. Drug tests administered at schools, for example, of sports teams, lie detector tests, or simply just including the threat of a lie detector test, comparing police or court records of known delinquents with what delinquents say in interviews with researchers, and so on. Another example of the drawbacks to self-report data is that juveniles often report trivial acts that could be recorded as delinquency. For example, a boy got in a fight with his brother over who got to play with the new toy first, just your typical argument amongst siblings. The interviewer asks, "Have you ever hit another person or gotten into a fight?" The boy says yes. The interviewer's notes end up coded into the data as simple assault. So what do? Each of these types of data has major advantages and disadvantages. A few rules of thumb. Rule number 1, use multiple data sources whenever possible. If you're researching vandalism, use self-report data, burglary data from the UCR, and victimization data. Rule number 2, be sure to choose the data that answer your research question. For example, if you're researching sexual assault, these are vastly underreported in the UCR. Use the National Crime Victimization Survey instead. If you're researching who is most likely to commit vehicle theft, use UCR data on arrest rates. Remember, the NCVS tries to collect info on what the victims saw, but few victims of vehicle theft actually ever see the theft occurring. And rule number 3, and this is perhaps the most important, see what others have done. Do a review of the research literature on your topic. Okay, moving on to Chapter 3, let's talk about how much delinquency is there and whether it's increasing. Note the difference between arrest rates and clearance rates. The arrest rate is the number of, or percent of arrests made for particular crimes, for example, larceny, theft. The clearance rate is the number of cases police have solved based on those arrests, and it equals the number of cases cleared divided by the number of total arrests. For example, in 2008, about 536,000 juveniles were arrested for Part 1 crimes, but only about 388,000 Part 1 crimes were cleared by the arrest of juveniles. This gives us a clearance rate of 388,000 divided by 536,000, which equals about 72%. Interestingly, in 2010, for all crimes, regardless of age, the clearance rate was only about 25%. Police would like to see a clearance rate of 100%. All arrests lead to cleared cases. But remember, that's based on arrest data. Self-report and victimization data paint a different picture. I want you to take a close look at Chapter 3 under the heading, How Much Self-Reported Delinquency Is There? There, you'll learn more about self-report surveys such as the Monitoring the Future survey and the National Youth Survey. You'll note that the large discrepancy between arrest data and self-report data highlights the fact that most delinquent acts do not come to the attention of the police or result in an arrest. Table 3.2 paints a much more detailed picture based on self-report data. Victimization data also provides another perspective, so take a close look at the section in Chapter 3 titled, How Many Juveniles Are Victimized and How Many Victimizations Are Committed by Juveniles. This will give you a sense of who is most likely to be victimized. For example, young people have higher rates of victimization than older people for violent crimes, which may be surprising to you. So, is juvenile delinquency increasing? We have to look at trends over time. When we look at delinquency rates over time, regardless of the source of data, the same patterns emerge. The juvenile arrest rates for Part 1 violent crimes and Part 1 property crimes were fairly stable in the 1980s. They spiked in the early 1990s, then they declined from the mid-1990s through 2008. See Figure 3.1 in Agnew and Brezina for specifics. Okay, that's arrest rates. The rates of self-reported delinquency for violent crimes decreased from 1980 to the mid-80s, then increased from the mid-80s through the mid-90s, then declined from the mid-90s through 2005, then increased again. The rates of self-reported delinquency for property crimes increased slightly but steadily through the 80s and into the mid-90s, then declined slightly from the mid-90s through 2008. See Figure 3.2 in Agnew and Brezina for specifics there. Lastly, When looking at the rate of violent victimizations committed by juveniles, these decreased slightly from 1980 through the mid-80s, increased significantly from the late 80s through the mid-90s, then declined significantly from the mid-90s through the mid-aughts. Take a look at figure 3.4 for more info. See the trends? There was a spike from the late 80s through the mid-90s in just about every type of crime and every type of report. Why the spike and then the decline? There are several possible explanations. First, there was a decline in the use of crack cocaine and associated dealer violence and reactions to potential dealer violence. Second, economic improvement in the 1990s led to more jobs, better income, less delinquency, less gang memberships, and so on. Third, there were improvements in police practices, community policing, and problem-oriented policing. Fourth, there was an increased use of prevention and rehabilitation programs for at-risk youth. And fifth and finally, juveniles were incarcerated at a higher rate in the 1990s. This meant fewer repeat offenders on the street. So that's a lot to absorb, chapters 2 and 3. Make sure you read the chapters closely, do the assignments in Canvas, and I'll see you online.